Hey everybody, this is Docker, and the idea of this video is to show you a couple of Docker commands, what Docker is, why do we need Docker. So let's just put a title, what is Docker? And a better question to answer would be why even do we need Docker, right? So why do we need Docker? Cool. So let's just go into a scenario. Say you want to deploy a front end and a back end application. And in the olden days, we would have a server, right? So we'd have a virtual machine. And what we would have is a VM. So we'd have one VM for our front end app. So VM1 or VMA would be our front end application, front end. And our second VM would be for our backend or our API, right? Now the front end would take X gigs of RAM and some storage, right? And then our backend would take Y gigs of RAM and some storage. And the networking is dependent on the amount of or the sophistication required. So if it's a backend application, it kind of requires external network access, and if it's a microservice that needs to be run internally, it does not really require network access. So it kind of depends on the use case. So what the problem with this is, let's say you have a server of your server capacity is, let's say 16 gigs or 32 gigs of RAM, and you have some limited storage, right? And say your backend is shared with the mobile application, and it's kind of uses a lot of external tools. So what the problem here is, backend is kind of heavy, but the front end is not actually really heavy. But then you kind of have to, because it's a VM, you just have to kind of put those resources in, right? This is a very bad way to kind of run applications today. So what Docker does is, Docker is basically a Linux image, right? It's kind of similar to a Linux image. It's similar to the bootfs system, and what it has is, all what you just do is you just copy all the code, all the runtime dependencies that it needs, and the minimal runtime dependencies that it needs, and you just execute your application from there. So what essentially means is, if you need to run a Python script, all you need is a Python, like minimal Python image. So that would be Python Alpine image. That's just 5 MB, 5 megabytes, and you could just use that. Say you want to run a server, then you could just a heavier application, and then move forward with that. So what we are trying to do today is, so we'll just check if we'll just run a couple of Docker commands, and the way you can just confirm you have is docker space minus minus version. It shows you the version that you have installed. Now you can actually install Docker with Docker Desktop. I'm on Linux, so I just use the base installation, and that works for me. Now, the way you kind of check what containers are running, you can just do Docker container ls, and it kind of shows you what containers are running, or you could just do Docker ps. And for the containers that are not running now, but it's not in our RAM, it's just ready to be started, you can actually do Docker ps space minus a, and it shows you a couple of containers. So how do I remove these containers, right? Now, if you look at this, there's a container ID here and some random name given to by Docker. But what I'm going to try and do here is to delete it in two different ways. So what I'm going to do is give the container ID. So I'm going to say docker rm 8a. You can just put in the whole container ID, but you could just, if it says like 8a, just autocomplete. Docker just checks and kind of deletes that. So if I do this, it says Docker just returns 8 to confirm that's deleted. So if I just do that, there you go, I just have one container now. Or I could use the name to kind of delete it. So I could say docker rm, so I could say Vigorous Hypatia, so random names. Okay, so if I check again, docker ps minus a, we have no containers running. That's cool. So how do I check what images I have, right? So image is basically a piece of software, like it's basically an operating system with the dependencies required to run your application. So I could say docker images, and it would show you all the images there are. And there are a lot of commands like docker volume ls to kind of check for the volumes, etc., etc. And this is how you kind of navigate. So let's say we want to run a Python script. right? And all our Python script does is just print hello world, right? So if I were to do that, I'm going to say app.py. What I'm going to do is print hello world. That's the easiest thing I want to do. And cool, I'll just exit out of that. And the way you create custom images is by saying creating a Docker file, right? So I'm going to say vim Docker file. I'm going to provide the image that I want to use. So I'm going to say Python colon 3, Python 3 image. I want to copy my script into my container. So I'm going to say copy app.py to the dot is the root position in the container. And then I want to execute it. I'm going to say cmd Python 3 app.py, right? I'll just put it inside these square brackets. That's kind of the syntax, right? And the way I build my image is by saying docker build minus t is for to tag my image. And then I can say, let's just say hello world, right? Hello world image, colon latest is my version tagging. And I can say the context, which is where is my Docker file? So dot means in the current directory. I'll just wait for that to build. There you go. I have my Docker image. I'll just kind of confirm if I have that image built. I'll just say Docker image and I'll grab that. So I'm going to say hello world image. Oops, Docker images, no Docker image. So there you go. We have that Docker image there. To run it, I can say Docker run hello world image, and that will just execute my code, right? Now, say you have a container running and you want to execute or kind of bash into the container. The way you can do is Docker run, let's just say Ubuntu Docker run space minus IT. That says I want an interactive terminal attached to it. And Ubuntu is the container that I want to run. Let's say latest, and bash is the program that I want to kind of get into. So you could either use sh or bash or any other terminal depending on what the container supports, and I can just use ssh, basically ssh into a container and do maybe execute some scripts or do some checks. So this is a very basic idea about how Docker works. There are a lot of commands, there are a lot of things to do, but the idea is, hey, you want to get started with Docker containers? Here you go. Thank you so much for watching.